How are you feeling in the aftermath of Peter Hitchens?
Validated, vindicated. I must say that I was I was in two minds about uploading that interview. There was a bit of a mixture of opinion coming from him. He wasn't speaking entirely clearly. It must have been something on his mind. He said, as he's getting up to walk out, I don't think you should run this.
I don't think you're entitled to run this.
And I'm thinking, look, if my guest tells me that they don't want me to run an interview for any reason, it could be because they've had a bad hair day, then I'll respect that. And so I thought, damn, am I really going to have to, be the bigger man here and just not post this at all? But then he kept saying, oh, run it if you like. Yeah, I can't stop you from running it. I just don't think you have any moral right to run it. Well,
Run it if you like.
I suppose there's nothing more I can say here. Run it if I like.
Right, sure, run if you like. I can't stop you.
I think people would be interested to see your views.
Morally, I don't think you're entitled to run a word.
I think people would be interested to hear your views.
Morally, you're not entitled to run a word of it. You just aren't.
And I asked him why. And he said it was because I am a propagandist for drug decriminalization, a subject which prior to that, by the way, I'd spoken about once, ever. And that I'd intentionally tricked him to appear on my podcast in order that I might fool him into a conversation about drugs.
You brought me here on false pretenses. You treated me with extreme bad manners, and you've done nothing but ask me about drugs. You didn't tell me you wanted an interview about drugs. You just did this.
Now, before the podcast started, I said, Mr. Hitchens, you have about 3 subject areas that we both talk about where I think there's a bit of crossover that you've either spoken about or indeed written books about. And those are the decriminalization of drugs. I also mentioned this in my email. The existence of God, or religion, I should say. God and religion is the topic. And the third was monarchy. At this point, he says, well, monarchy is a bit boring. Okay, notice, listener, that he did not take this opportunity to tell me that he thought that drugs were a bit boring and would rather not really talk about drugs at all or for too long. Okay, fine. So I'm thinking, I agree with you. The monarchy is incredibly boring. In fact, that's the entirety of my point about the monarchy, is that it's essentially just boring more than anything else. So let's just do the other 2. So I say, we'll run for about an hour, ideally. He says, that's good, And I say, but, if the conversation flows, it can be an hour and a half. It could be 2 hours. And okay, he says, well, look, I say sometimes they can be 3 hours long. He says, well, 3 hours might be a bit long, but we'll see how we do. So I'm thinking about an hour and a half. An hour and a half on what was now, in my view, 2 subjects.
Extremely bad manners and very bad press.
We spoke beforehand. I said I wanted to talk about drugs and God.
You didn't say I want to spend an hour discussing drugs, including half an hour discussing Portugal.
I'm sorry if that was too long. I really
That's too long. This interview was supposed to be an hour. We've practically finished that hour. We have not moved from the subject of drugs. So where is it saying in your communications with me, I want to interview you for an hour about drugs?
Just before the interview, I said, I want to talk about drugs, I want to talk about God, I want to talk about the monarchy.
No, I came here.
You said that's fine, but the monarchy's boring.
London. You didn't say we're going to have an hour's discussion about drugs, including half the thing on Portugal.
So at about 40 minutes into this potentially 90-minute podcast on the same topic, when he told me that we'd been going around for too long on said topic, I was a little bit bemused. But I did think to myself, maybe I've done something wrong here. Maybe I have upset him in a way that obviously was not intentional. I wasn't trying to bring this out of him, although, it does do quite well for the channel. It's not like it's something I would do intentionally. So I did think to myself, well, maybe I've done something. So I listened back and I sent it to some friends, including you, and thank you for listening to it, and saying that, most people just said, you have to run this. He's been completely unreasonable. And so there have been criticisms. People have said, well, you know what, it was a bit boring. Or, yeah, it was going around in circles. I submit that was his fault, by the way, because he does this thing, which I've noticed in a lot of philosophical and political discussion, which is the sort of, I know this one attitude. When you do a lot of interviews, I find that you have a sort of, I know this one. And so
they answer the question that they heard, not the answer that was asked.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it happens, especially when it's easy enough to make that mistake if you're not listening carefully. So he was talking about I asked him about the decriminalization of cannabis, and he says that, well, this will essentially mean that a lot of more children will be smoking it. He had this contention that children would end up smoking cannabis. And I thought to myself, well, okay, I can understand that concern, of course, but I think the tobacco industry has suffered quite a blow in still being perfectly legal to buy as an adult, but kids just aren't smoking cigarettes anymore. It's just not a thing that's really done. Why is that? In other words, we've had quite a successful education campaign whereby it's not popular for kids to smoke anymore, and yet it's still perfectly legal. Can't we have a similar approach to cannabis? Potentially, by the way, not a good view. Potentially a perfectly rebuttable view. I'm not sure. But I wouldn't know because I didn't get a rebuttal to that view. Instead, I just heard, all you can do is do the whole, which by the way is a genuinely quite tired line in this debate, the whole, oh, what about smoking? Or indeed another point where I brought up alcohol. Well, all you can say is, what about alcohol? What about smoking?
So stop saying to me, well, what about alcohol? Every time I mention that we should do something about marijuana. Instead of taking the point and listening to what I say, you can only come up with, but what about alcohol? It's banal. It's time wasting. And frankly, I can't be bothered with it. You have to say something intelligent in response rather than, what about alcohol?
And that's not what I was doing. At least I contend that's not what I was doing. Because that's what he heard. He goes, oh, I know this one. I've heard this before. Yeah, and you haven't read my book.
I've written about it. You've not read what I've written about it.
I have.
You obviously haven't read my book.
I have read your book.
Well, you're obviously reading it with the lights off. You're not aware of anything that I've said.
It didn't seem to occur to him that it is possible, Mr. Hitchens, to read your book and yet still, after having done so, disagree with you.
Yeah, it's sometimes when you hear people speak, especially guys that are a little bit older, I think there is kind of like reverse ageism that goes on, which is, who is this sort of young whippersnapper person who I maybe have heard of or haven't heard of much, and almost like a blasé kind of discrediting of the thing. It's like, this is your show, but it's my show, so to speak. And it was like, I thought his attitude was pompous and unlikable. And my favorite part was when he threw the pillow at the microphone.
Throwing the pillow down, and he kept sort of walking back over. He says, I don't want you to post this, and
You're
yet
obsessed with
and yet walk
I had
back
no
over to the
opinion about you
microphone.
before.
Yeah.
I've decided that I absolutely do not like you.
The reason that you seem angry at me is
I don't like you.
Okay.
That's the reason. I really don't like you.
That's fine.
I really have decided in the past hour that I really do not like you at all.
That's fine.
I had no opinions on you before. Now I actively dislike you. You're obsessed with drugs.
It was quite something, and a lot of people messaged me saying, "Hey, I'm so sorry that happened. Like, you're doing all right." And I'm thinking, sorry. I thought there's no way that this is happening. I mean, when it looked like he was about to get up, I thought surely not. But then internally, I'm thinking, like, go on then, do it.
Yeah,
do it, because I don't think I've done anything wrong here.
It was the podcasting equivalent of "Come on, mate, have a go."
Yeah, but you know what the weirdest thing was, because he sort of gets up to go, and he walks out, and he stands at the door, and I wish you kind of could have seen his body language. It was very much. There's one point where you can see it when he walks back into shot, and he says something, and then after he said it, he just sort of stands there, looking at me, as if to say, like, "What have you got?
Have a go."
And so he'd keep going, like, "I'm going to go now. I'm going. I'm going," and waiting.
Is this the podcast playing hard to get equivalent?
It must have been something like that. Yeah, it was like the person who wants the fight but wants to look like they didn't initiate the fight.
Right.
And I don't think it's my fault. I'll leave it up to the judgment of the listener or the viewer. I don't think it's my fault that he spent 17 minutes, 17, count them, 17 entire minutes, stood at the door telling me how much he personally dislikes me, telling me how much he doesn't want to see me again.
I've wanted to do that for as long as I've known you, so...
Well, we'll see how we do.
Yeah.
I never ever want to see you again.